4:00 a.m., Los Angeles, the Capitol Records Tower. The studio was thick with a haze of cigarette smoke that hung in the air like a blue ghost. The orchestra had packed up hours ago. The conductor was rubbing his eyes, his back aching, begging for sleep. But the man in the center of the room wasn't moving. Frank Sinatra stood by the microphone, his tie loosened, his hat tipped back on his head. He held a glass of Jack Daniels in one hand and a sheet of lyrics in the other. He had sung the same line 50 times, 50 takes, and he still wasn't satisfied. He stared at the sound engineer behind the glass and held up a single finger. Again, he whispered. The engineer sighed, reset the tape, and the room went silent. To the world, Frank Sinatra was the definition of easy cool. He was the man who snapped his fingers and made the world dance. But in that studio, at 4 a.m., there was no swagger. There was only a terrifying, obsessive need to be perfect. A need that kept him awake when the rest of the world was dreaming. By the way, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? Most people think they know Frank Sinatra. They see the tuxedo, the smile, the Rat Pack partying in Las Vegas. They see a man who had it all handed to him on a silver platter of talent. But that is the greatest illusion in the history of entertainment. The truth is, Frank Sinatra lived a double life for 60 years. There was the public Frank, the arrogant, confident chairman of the board. And then there was the private Frank, a man haunted by insomnia, a man who practiced holding his breath underwater until his lungs burned just to sing a longer phrase, a man who was terrified that if he stopped working for even 1 second, he would lose everything. This story isn't about the fame. It's about the fear that fueled the fame. It's about the nights of loneliness that created the most romantic voice in history. If you think you know the cost of greatness, you might want to think again. To understand the obsession, you have to go back to the very beginning, to a cold kitchen in Hoboken, New Jersey, in 1915. Frank didn't come into the world singing. He came into the world fighting. His birth was traumatic. The doctor used forceps so forcefully that they scarred the left side of his face and punctured his eardrum. He wasn't breathing. The doctor actually laid the baby on the kitchen counter, thinking he was stillborn, and turned to attend to the mother. It was his grandmother who picked him up, ran him under cold water, and slapped his back until he finally cried out. That was his first lesson. Survival isn't given, it is taken. He carried those scars on his neck and face his entire life, covering them with makeup and high collars, but the internal scar was deeper. He felt he had to prove he had a right to be here. By the time he was a teenager, he had decided he wanted to be a singer, but he didn't just want to sing, he wanted to dominate. He saw Bing Crosby, the biggest star in the world, and told his friends, "I'm going to be bigger than him." They laughed. Frank was skinny, small, and had a high-pitched speaking voice, but he had a secret weapon, his lungs. He realized early on that to hold the audience's attention, he needed to sing long, unbroken phrases without gasping for air. So he began a brutal training regimen. He would go to the public pool and swim laps underwater, holding his breath until his chest felt like it was going to explode. He would run for miles, singing to himself, training his diaphragm like a prize fighter trains his fists. This wasn't a hobby. It was an addiction to improvement. In the 1940s, when Sinatra mania hit and thousands of girls were fainting at his feet, the press called it hysteria. They said he was just a pretty face with a microphone. They didn't see him in his hotel room after the shows. While his bandmates were out drinking or sleeping, Frank was analyzing the acoustics of the microphones. He treated the microphone not as a piece of metal, but as an instrument. He learned how to move inches closer to whisper a lyric intimately, and how to pull back just enough to belt a high note without distortion. He studied the violin playing of Jascha Heifetz to learn how to bow a phrase without breaking the line. He was a musical scientist in the body of a pop idol, but the obsession with perfection had a dark side. He couldn't sleep, literally. Frank Sinatra suffered from chronic insomnia his entire life. He dreaded the night. He terrified of the silence. "I'm afraid to close my eyes," he once told a friend, "because I might miss something." So he worked. He read scripts until dawn. He listened to demo records until the grooves wore out. He built a lifestyle where the party never stopped, not because he loved partying, but because he feared being alone with his own thoughts in the dark. If you are someone who understands the drive to keep pushing when others are resting, if you are fascinated by the hidden discipline behind the legends, subscribe for new stories so you don't miss the next chapter of this journey. Then came the crash, the early 1950s. This is the part of the double life that almost killed him. The public saw a fading star. His records stopped selling. The girls stopped screaming. He was losing his hair. His marriage to Nancy fell apart, and his tempestuous relationship with Ava Gardner was destroying him emotionally. But the worst blow happened on stage at the Copacabana in New York. He opened his mouth to sing, and nothing came out. Dust. His vocal cords had hemorrhaged. The one thing he trusted, the one thing that was his identity, had betrayed him. MGM fired him. His agent dropped him. He was walking down the street in New York, and he saw crowds waiting in line, not for him, but for the new guy, Eddie Fisher. Frank Sinatra, the voice of a generation, was considered a has-been at age 35. This wasn't just a career slump. It was a death sentence for his ego. Friends remember seeing him sitting in his apartment, staring at the gas oven, contemplating suicide. The silence he feared so much had finally caught him. But this is where the obsession saved him. A normal person would have retired. A normal person would have found a new line of work. Frank Sinatra went to work. He didn't just want to come back. He wanted revenge on everyone who had written him off. He rested his voice in total silence for weeks, communicating only with a notepad, terrified that one whispered word would ruin him forever. When he finally spoke again, the voice was different. The sweetness of the boy from Hoboken was gone. It was replaced by something darker, richer, deeper. It was the voice of a man who had lost everything and survived. He signed with Capitol Records, a deal that paid him peanuts just to get back in the studio. And this is when the true chairman of the board was born. He partnered with arranger Nelson Riddle, and the work ethic went into overdrive. Frank didn't just record songs, he built emotional landscapes. He created the concept album. He would spend weeks planning the exact order of the songs to tell a story of heartbreak or joy. In the studio, his authority was absolute. He insisted on recording live with the orchestra in the room. No overdubbing, no tricks. He wanted the energy of the musicians to bleed into his vocal. If a trumpet player missed a note, Frank heard it. If the drummer dragged the tempo by a fraction of a second, Frank stopped the take. "It's not right," he would say. "We do it again." He would do 20, 30 takes of a song like "I've Got You Under My Skin" until the groove was so deep it felt like a heartbeat. The musicians respected him, but they also feared him. They knew that he demanded more from himself than he did from them. He was chasing a sound that only he could hear in his head. There is a famous story from the recording of the album in the wee small hours. It was past midnight. The studio was dark. Frank was singing about loneliness, about the girl who got away. He was pouring his own pain over Ava Gardner into the microphone. He looked around at the musicians, men who had seen it all, and he saw them crying, tears running down their faces as they played. He had turned his personal tragedy into art through sheer, brutal discipline. He wasn't just singing. He was acting. He was reliving the worst moments of his life, take after take, just to get the emotion perfect on the tape. This was the height of the Rat Pack era, the late 50s and early 60s. To the public, Frank was the ultimate party animal. Las Vegas, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr. drinking whiskey on stage, cracking jokes, living the high life. It looked like chaos. It looked like they were just winging it, but that was the performance. Behind the scenes, Frank was the general. He planned the jokes. He timed the spontaneous interruptions. He choreographed the chaos. He would stay up all night gambling and drinking with the guys, and then, while they passed out, he would go to his suite, shower, shave, and read a screenplay for his next movie or study the arrangement for the next night's show. He refused to let the cracks show. He created a suit of armor made of silk suits and arrogance, but the pressure was immense. He was running a record label, acting in movies, touring the world, and dealing with alleged mob ties and FBI investigations. He was carrying the weight of an empire, and he was doing it on 3 hours of sleep a night. He would call his friends at 5 a.m., desperate for conversation. "Hey, what are you doing?" he'd ask. If they said, "Sleeping, Frank," he would feel betrayed. He needed noise. He needed life, because if the noise stopped, he would have to look in the mirror and see the scared kid from Hoboken again. If you are captivated by this look into the hidden struggles of an icon, and you want to support this kind of storytelling, please subscribe for new stories. It helps us bring these legends back to life. Frank Sinatra announced his retirement. He was 55 years old. He said he was tired. He gave a farewell concert in Los Angeles. It was emotional. He sang "Angel Eyes," and on the final line, "Excuse me while I disappear," the stage went black. He lit a cigarette and walked off. The audience wept. They thought it was over. Frank thought it was over. He wanted to rest. He wanted to play golf, paint, maybe finally get some sleep, but he couldn't. The silence was deafening. Without the applause, without the next session, without the pressure, he felt invisible. He lasted less than 2 years. In 1973, he announced, "Old Blue Eyes is back." The album title was a statement. He was returning to the arena. But the voice was changing. The top notes were getting harder to reach. The breath control, the thing he had built his entire life on, was slipping. A lesser artist would have quit. Frank Sinatra simply worked harder. He adjusted his style. He couldn't sustain the long notes like he did in the 40s, so he became a master of phrasing. He used the rhythm to hide his limitations. He started acting the lyrics more than singing them. them. But the anxiety was skyrocketing. Before a show, he was a wreck. He would pace his dressing room like a caged tiger, snapping at his valet, drinking hot tea with honey, terrified that the voice wouldn't be there. He knew the audience was waiting for the voice. He felt he owed it to them. The 1980s and 90s were a war of attrition. His memory started to fade. He would be in the middle of Mac the Knife, a song he had sung thousands of times, and the lyrics would vanish from his mind. It was his worst nightmare coming true. To combat this, he started using teleprompters, huge screens placed around the stage. Critics mocked him. They said he was too old. They said he should give up, but they didn't understand. He couldn't give up. Singing was the only time he felt truly alive. It was the only time the noise in his head made sense. The recording of the Duets album in 1993 is the perfect example of his late-life eccentricity and obsession. He was 77 years old. He agreed to record with the biggest stars of the day, Bono, Luther Vandross, Barbra Streisand, but he had a condition. He refused to be in the studio with them. He refused to wear headphones. He wanted to sing live with the orchestra, just like in the old days. He recorded his parts alone in Capitol Studios, standing in the exact same spot where he had stood 40 years earlier. He was frail. His eyes were watery. But when the red light went on, he summoned the ghost of the chairman. He fought for every note. He intimidated the engineers. "Is it on the tape?" he would bark. He didn't want charity. He didn't want people to say, "He's good for an old man." He wanted to be the best, period. The partners recorded their vocals later, thousands of miles away, singing along to Frank's tape. It was a technological marvel, but emotionally, it was fitting. Frank Sinatra, the man who sang about loneliness better than anyone, was singing his final hit album entirely alone. One of the most heartbreaking moments came in 1994 during a concert in Richmond, Virginia. It was hot. The lights were bright. Frank was singing My Way, his anthem, the song that defined his defiance. Halfway through, his knees buckled. He collapsed. The audience gasped. His son, Frank Jr., who was conducting the orchestra, rushed to his side. Frank was confused, dehydrated, exhausted. The doctors told him it was time. "You have to stop, Frank. Your heart can't take it." He nodded. He went home to Palm Springs. But even then, the double life didn't end. He would sit by the pool, staring at the mountains, and his friends said he would hum quietly, still phrasing, still working the timing, still trying to get it right. The music was burned into his DNA. He once said, "You gotta love it, you gotta need it," and he needed it more than oxygen. In his final years, dementia began to steal his memories. The man who remembered every grudge, every favor, every lyric, started to forget who he was. But there is a story that his family tells. Even when he couldn't remember names, if you put on one of his records, if you played the opening notes of "One for My Baby," his eyes would light up. He would tap his foot. He knew exactly when the brass section was supposed to come in. The musician was the last part of him to die. Frank Sinatra passed away on May 14th, 1998. The lights on the Las Vegas Strip were dimmed in his honor. The world played his songs. Everyone talked about the legend, the swagger, the style. But now, when you listen to his music, try to hear something else. Don't just hear the smooth melody. Hear the breath control born from underwater laps in a public pool. Hear the phrasing perfected in lonely hotel rooms at 4 a.m. Hear the emotion dug out of the deepest heartbreak. And silence. Before we reach the end of this story, if you believe that true artistry requires sacrifice, make sure you subscribe for new stories. We have many more legends to explore. Frank Sinatra's life was a masterclass in resilience. He showed us that talent is cheap, but discipline is expensive. He paid for his legacy with his peace of mind. He traded sleep for perfection. He sacrificed normalcy for immortality. He was terrified of being forgotten, so he made sure he was unforgettable. The next time you see that image of Frank in the tuxedo, holding the glass, laughing with the boys, remember the other Frank, the one in the empty studio, the one staring at the microphone like it was a wild animal he had to tame. That was the real man, the man who lived the wee small hours so we could have the music. The double life of Frank Sinatra wasn't a lie. It was a necessity. He needed the armor of the chairman to protect the soul of the poet. And in the end, he did it his way. Not the easy way, but the hard, relentless, lonely, beautiful way. And that is why, nearly a century after he was born, we are still listening. We aren't just listening to a singer. We are listening to a man who refused to let the silence win. Now, I want to hear from you. Which Sinatra song hits you the hardest? And do you think the sacrifice he made was worth it? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden life of Old Blue Eyes, please subscribe for new stories. See you in the next video.